What happens when political tensions boil over into personal attacks on national television? The country would soon find out during what was supposed to be a routine panel discussion at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference. The ballroom at the Washington Convention Center buzzed with anticipation as the moderator introduced the panelists for the discussion on voting rights legislation. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District, adjusted her microphone as she settled into her seat. Known for her passionate advocacy and sharp legal mind, Crockett had quickly established herself as a rising star since her election to Congress. Across the table sat Karoline Leavitt, the young former Trump White House staffer who had recently been appointed as a special advisor to the Republican National Committee's Election Integrity Initiative. At just 28, Leavitt had developed a reputation for her combative media appearances and unflinching loyalty to her political allies. "We'll begin with opening statements," the moderator announced. "Ms. Leavitt, would you like to start?" Leavitt leaned forward with a practiced smile. "Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this discussion, though I must say, I'm surprised to be included given the partisan nature of this event." Her eyes darted toward Crockett. "But I welcome the opportunity to set the record straight about what election integrity really means." For 10 minutes, Leavitt outlined her position, emphasizing voter ID requirements and restrictions on mail-in ballots. As she spoke, Crockett maintained a composed expression, though her fingers tapped rhythmically against her notepad. When it was Crockett's turn, she addressed the audience directly. "What we've just heard represents a fundamental misunderstanding, perhaps willful, of the real barriers to voting that exist in this country." Leavitt rolled her eyes, not bothering to hide her disdain. "The fact is," Crockett continued, "these so-called integrity measures disproportionately affect Black and brown communities. The data is clear on this point." "The data can be manipulated to say whatever you want it to," Leavitt interjected, though her microphone was off. The moderator attempted to maintain order. "Please, let's have each speaker finish their statements before responding." When the discussion opened for debate, the tension escalated quickly. "Congressman Crockett," Leavitt said, deliberately using the wrong title, "your entire argument is based on the offensive premise that certain communities aren't capable of obtaining ID or following basic rules that the rest of America has no problem with." Crockett's expression hardened. "Ms. Leavitt, I'd appreciate if you'd use my correct title. And what's offensive is your implication that systemic barriers don't exist simply because you haven't experienced them." "Here we go again with the systemic talking point," Leavitt said with air quotes. "Always the same playbook. When you can't win on the merits, just claim racism." The audience stirred uncomfortably. In the third row, an older gentleman in a crisp navy suit sat up straighter, his attention fully focused on the exchange. "Ms. Leavitt," Crockett replied evenly, "I haven't mentioned racism. You brought that up. But since you did, let's talk about the documented history of these policies and their impacts." "What I'm talking about is accountability," Leavitt shot back, her voice rising. "Some communities just need to take more personal responsibility, instead of waiting for government handouts." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Crockett's expression remained controlled, but her eyes flashed with anger. "Which communities exactly are you referring to, Ms. Leavitt?" she asked quietly. "We all know which voting precincts have the most irregularities," Leavitt replied. "Predominantly urban areas where, frankly, educational outcomes aren't great. Maybe if people took education more seriously in these communities, they wouldn't struggle with something as simple as following voting procedures." The moderator tried to intervene. "Let's refocus on policy rather than—" "No," Crockett interrupted. "I'd like Ms. Leavitt to clarify exactly what she's implying about these communities." Leavitt smirked. "I'm just saying some cultures prioritize different things. That's not controversial. It's reality. Your community has different priorities, and that's fine. But don't blame the system when those priorities don't lead to the same outcomes." The room fell silent. In the third row, the gentleman in the navy suit slowly removed his glasses. The silence that gripped the room was broken by Crockett's measured response. "My community? And what exactly do you know about my community, Ms. Leavitt?" "Look, I'm just saying what everyone thinks but is too afraid to say out loud," Leavitt pressed on, seemingly emboldened by the tension. "The statistics don't lie. When certain neighborhoods consistently underperform, at some point we need to look at cultural factors instead of blaming invisible systemic forces." The moderator cleared his throat. "I think we should—" "No, please," Crockett interrupted, her voice steady but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I'd like Ms. Leavitt to continue. This is illuminating." Something in Crockett's tone should have warned Leavitt to proceed with caution, but the younger woman seemed to interpret it as weakness. "All I'm saying is that there's a reason these policies affect certain communities more than others," Leavitt continued. "And it's not racism. It's that some communities haven't adapted to meet basic standards. The black community has had every opportunity and program thrown their way for decades. At some point, you have to ask why they're still struggling with something as simple as getting an ID." A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. Several people turned to look at the man in the navy suit, who remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "The black community," Crockett repeated softly. "Ms. Leavitt, would you care to elaborate on what you know about the black community, since you seem to consider yourself an expert?" Leavitt gave a dismissive wave. "I'm just stating facts. Look at the educational outcomes, the crime rates." "Correlation is not causation," Crockett cut in. "As an attorney, that's one of the first principles." "That's another thing," Leavitt interrupted. "Always hiding behind credentials and technicalities, instead of addressing reality. This is why nothing improves. Your people—" She caught herself, but it was too late. "My people?" Crockett's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Please continue. Tell me about my people." A woman in the front row turned to her neighbor and whispered something. The whisper traveled through the crowd like a wave, reaching the man in the navy suit. He nodded once, then stood up. Leavitt, oblivious to the shifting dynamics in the room, forged ahead. "Look, I'm not trying to make this personal, but when we talk about these communities, predominantly black communities, we need to acknowledge the cultural issues at play, the breakdown of the family structure, the glorification of certain lifestyles, the victim mentality that leaders like you perpetuate." "Ms. Leavitt," the moderator tried again, more forcefully this time. "No, let her finish," Crockett said, her voice remarkably controlled. "I want everyone to hear exactly what she has to say about cultural issues and family structures." Leavitt seemed to sense something had shifted but couldn't identify what. "I'm just saying that when fathers aren't present in the home, when educational achievement isn't valued, when there's a culture of dependency, these are the real issues, not voter ID laws." The man in the navy suit began walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage. A few people nodded in recognition as he passed. "So you're suggesting," Crockett said, "that the black community has these problems because, what? We don't value education? Our families are broken? We prefer dependency?" "The statistics speak for themselves," Leavitt replied, doubling down. "And until leaders in your community acknowledge these hard truths instead of crying racism at every turn, nothing will change." The man had reached the steps to the stage now. A security guard moved to intercept him, but the moderator gave a small shake of his head. The guard stepped back. "Ms. Leavitt," Crockett said, "I think you've made your position abundantly clear, and while I could sit here and educate you on the complex socioeconomic factors at play, the history of redlining, the impact of the war on drugs on black communities, the underfunding of schools in minority districts, I don't think you're interested in actual facts." "That's the problem right there," Leavitt shot back. "Always excuses, never accountability. I'm simply suggesting that maybe, just maybe, The reason these policies affect your community more is that your community isn't meeting the standard. And instead of raising people up to meet that standard, leaders like you lower the bar and call the standard itself racist. The man had reached the edge of the stage now. The moderator, recognizing him, stood and offered his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator said into his microphone, "I'd like to take a moment to introduce someone who has joined us. Dr. James Crockett, former dean of Howard University's School of Education, and father of our panelist, Congresswoman Crockett." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Leavitt's expression froze as she turned to look at the distinguished man now standing at the edge of the platform. "Dr. Crockett," the moderator continued, "would you care to join us? I believe you might have some insight on the topic of educational values in the Black community." James Crockett stepped onto the stage with a dignified bearing that commanded immediate respect. At 72, he moved with the confidence of a man who had spent his life in positions of authority. His daughter's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a glimmer of something, perhaps satisfaction, as her father approached. The panel table. Dr. James Crockett adjusted his tie as he took the seat offered to him at the panel table. The moderator quickly arranged for an additional microphone. Throughout this brief interlude, Karoline Leavitt shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her earlier bravado noticeably diminished. "Thank you for joining us, Dr. Crockett," the moderator said. "As the conversation has turned to education and values in various communities, your perspective as both an educator and father might be valuable." Dr. Crockett nodded, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Thank you for accommodating me." His voice carried the weight of decades spent in lecture halls, clear, measured, and authoritative without being overbearing. "I've been listening with great interest to this discussion." He turned slightly toward Leavitt, who was now staring fixedly at her notepad. "Ms. Leavitt, I believe you were sharing some thoughts about the Black community's values regarding education and family structure?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Leavitt cleared her throat. "I was simply discussing broader policy implications and statistical realities." "Interesting," Dr. Crockett replied, "because I distinctly heard specific claims about cultural values, educational priorities, and family structures. As someone who has spent 50 years in education, 30 of those years researching achievement gaps and their causes, I found your analysis rather simplistic." Leavitt's cheeks flushed. "With all due respect, sir, sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one." "Ah, Occam's razor," Dr. Crockett nodded. "A useful principle when all variables are accounted for. However, when applied without historical context or socio-economic understanding, it becomes nothing more than a justification for prejudice." A few audience members applauded. Jasmine Crockett remained silent, watching the exchange with composed attention. "I'm not prejudiced," Leavitt protested, her voice rising slightly. "I'm talking about patterns that are documented in research." "Indeed?" Dr. Crockett raised an eyebrow. "As someone who has published extensively on educational outcomes across demographics, I'd be interested to know which research you're referencing. Perhaps the work of Claude Steele on stereotype threat? Or maybe John Ogbou's cultural ecological theory? Lisa Delpit's exploration of power dynamics in education, perhaps?" Leavitt's silence spoke volumes. "No?" Dr. Crockett continued. "Then possibly you're familiar with the longitudinal studies on resource disparities between predominantly white and predominantly Black school districts? The research showing that Black families actually place higher value on education than many other demographics despite having fewer resources to support educational achievement? Those studies have methodological flaws," Leavitt attempted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Every study has limitations," Dr. Crockett acknowledged. "That's why serious scholars consider multiple sources of evidence rather than cherry-picking. Statistics that confirm existing biases." He leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Leavitt, you mentioned absent fathers. Are you aware that when controlling for socioeconomic factors, Black fathers who don't live with their children are actually more likely to maintain daily or weekly contact than fathers of other races in similar circumstances? I wasn't, Leavitt began, or that the valorization of education in black households often exceeds that of their white counterparts, as measured by parental involvement in homework, emphasis on college attendance, and sacrifices made to support educational opportunities? The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. What you've offered today isn't analysis, Ms. Leavitt. It's recitation of stereotypes that have been debunked by decades of actual research. Dr. Crockett's tone remained even, which somehow made his words more devastating. And while you're entitled to your opinions, presenting them as facts does a disservice to this discussion and to the American people. Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. Dad, I appreciate your perspective, but I can handle this. Of course you can, Dr. Crockett said with a small smile. You always could. But sometimes a father wants to step in, even when his daughter is more than capable. He turned back to Leavitt. You know, I've spent my career trying to bridge divides and correct misunderstandings. I've found that most harmful beliefs stem not from malice, but from limited exposure and education. Perhaps this could be a learning opportunity. Leavitt seemed to rally somewhat. I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Crockett, but I stand by my point that policies aimed at ensuring election integrity aren't racist simply because they may affect different communities differently. That's a more nuanced position than your earlier statements, Dr. Crockett noted, and one that reasonable people could debate. But that's not what you said before, is it? You made specific claims about my community and our values. Leavitt glanced at Jasmine Crockett, who was watching her steadily. I may have spoken too broadly, Leavitt conceded reluctantly. Indeed, Dr. Crockett agreed. And perhaps therein lies the problem with much of our political discourse. We speak too broadly about communities we know too little about. Jasmine. Crockett leaned forward. Ms. Leavitt, I'm curious. Have you spent much time in the communities you were describing? Have you visited the underfunded schools in my district? Spoken with the parents working multiple jobs to support their children's education? Met the community leaders organizing voter registration drives despite the increasing obstacles? I haven't had the opportunity to, Leavitt began. That's exactly the point, Jasmine cut in. You speak with such certainty about communities you haven't experienced. You diagnose cultural failings without having witnessed the incredible strength, resilience, and yes, devotion to education and family that exists in these same communities. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to redirect the conversation, intervened. Perhaps this highlights the importance of perspective and lived experience in policy discussions. Ms. Leavitt, would you like to respond? Leavitt straightened in her chair, visibly struggling to regain her footing in the conversation. I think we can acknowledge that different perspectives exist without dismissing the importance of objective measures and standards. The question remains whether policies should be adjusted because they impact communities differently. Dr. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. A fair question, but one that requires us to examine why those differential impacts exist in the first place. If a policy disproportionately burdens one community, we must ask whether that burden serves a necessary purpose, or whether it's an unintended, or perhaps intended, consequence of the policy's design. The tension in the room had transformed, from hostile confrontation to something more complex, a palpable intensity underscored by the weight of the moment. Cameras continued to roll as attendees exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Ms. Leavitt, Jasmine Crockett said, I think we've established that broad generalizations about communities serve no constructive purpose. Let's return to the specific policies we're discussing. You support voter ID requirements that, according to multiple studies, disproportionately affect Black and Latino voters. The question isn't whether these communities value civic participation. Less, they demonstrably don't. The question is why these barriers exist and whom they actually serve. Leavitt seemed caught between doubling down and retreat. She chose a third path: deflection. The barriers are greatly exaggerated. Getting an ID isn't an insurmountable obstacle for anyone truly motivated to vote. Dr. Crockett cleared his throat. When I was a boy in rural Mississippi, my father had to take a day off work, losing a day's wages, to travel 30 miles to the county seat, where he faced a deliberately complex registration process designed to discourage black voters. Today's methods are more subtle, but share the same purpose. With respect, Dr. Crockett, Leavitt countered, comparing modern voting requirements to Jim Crow-era restrictions is inflammatory and dishonest. Is it? Jasmine asked. Or is it that the tactics have evolved while the strategy remains? Let me share something with you, Ms. Leavitt. In my district, after a polling location in a predominantly black neighborhood was closed, the nearest alternative was 3 bus rides away. For someone working multiple jobs with limited child care, that's not a minor inconvenience. It's functionally disenfranchisement. Dr. Crockett nodded. And this is precisely why historical context matters. When we see patterns repeating, polling, places closing in certain neighborhoods, ID requirements that just happen to exclude forms of identification more commonly held by minority voters, we recognize the echoes of our history. The moderator sensed an opening for a more productive exchange. Ms. Leavitt, how would you address these specific concerns about access? Something in Leavitt's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognition that her usual talking points wouldn't suffice in this moment. I believe we can maintain ballot security while ensuring reasonable access. More polling locations could be justified, for example. That's a start, Jasmine acknowledged, but it still doesn't address the fundamental issue, the assumption that there's widespread fraud requiring these measures in the first place. The evidence simply doesn't support it. The perception of integrity is as important as integrity itself, Leavitt countered. People need to trust the system. I agree completely, Dr. Crockett said, surprising Leavitt, which is why rhetoric matters so deeply. When political figures routinely suggest, without evidence, that votes from certain communities are suspect, they undermine that very trust. When they characterize these communities as lacking values or structure, they're continuing a long-standing tradition of delegitimizing their participation. Leavitt appeared momentarily speechless, caught between her prepared arguments and the realization that she was facing not just political opponents, but people with lived experience that directly contradicted her assertions. You know, Jasmine said, her tone softening slightly, I didn't come into politics looking for fights. I became an attorney and then a legislator because I saw how policies affected real people. My neighbors, my family, my community. Not abstract statistics, but human beings with hopes and challenges, and yes, deep values. She leaned forward. The frustration you heard in my voice earlier wasn't just about your words, Ms. Leavitt. It was about the damage those words do when they're repeated by people with platforms and power. They become justifications for policies that hurt real people, people I represent and care about. The audience was completely still, captivated by the unexpected turn toward authentic dialogue. Dr. Crockett smiled at his daughter with unmistakable pride before addressing Leavitt. In my 50 years of education, I've found that the most powerful learning happens when we're willing to be uncomfortable, when we encounter perspectives that challenge our assumptions. Today could be such an opportunity, Ms. Leavitt, if you're willing to consider it as such. Something in his gentle but unyielding dignity seemed to reach Leavitt in a way that confrontation hadn't. Her defensive posture relaxed slightly. I stand by my concerns about election security, she said, but I recognize that some of my earlier statements about communities were overly broad and perhaps informed by limited exposure. It wasn't a full concession, but in the context of modern political discourse, it was remarkable. That acknowledgement takes courage, Dr. Crockett said. Perhaps this is where progress begins, not in complete agreement, but in the willingness to question our certainties. Jasmine nodded. I'd welcome the opportunity to show you my district, Ms. Leavitt, to introduce you to the families and community leaders who defy the stereotypes you described, not to change your politics, but to complicate your understanding. The moderator, recognizing the rare moment of potential bridge building, seized the opportunity. Would you be open to that, Ms. Leavitt? All eyes turned to the young political operative who had entered the room so confident in her positions and talking points. For perhaps the first time that day, her expression reflected genuine contemplation rather than strategic calculation. I would consider it, she said finally, though I can't promise it would change my policy positions. Understanding should precede policy, Dr. Crockett said. Always. As the discussion moved toward closing statements, the energy in the room had transformed. The initial hostility had given way to something more valuable. Not agreement, but a glimpse of what political discourse could be when it acknowledged the humanity behind the positions. Later, as attendees filed out, conversations buzzed with analysis of what they'd witnessed. Some saw it as a masterclass in handling racial insensitivity with dignity. Others appreciated the rare moment of potential growth in an era of entrenched positions. Near the exit, Dr. Crockett placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You didn't need my help in there," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Jasmine replied with a small smile. "But sometimes it's nice to have backup, especially when that backup has 3 PhDs and can cite research studies from memory." "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for standing your ground, but for trying to build a bridge at the end. That's harder." "I learned from the best," she answered, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room forever changed by what had transpired there, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't just confrontation, but an invitation to greater understanding.